GTX 260. NVIDIA accidentally released the people's champion while trying to sell the king. Two NVIDIA cards on the shelf. One is $400. One is $200. The $200 one is faster in almost every game you'd actually play. The GTX 260 was a cut-down GTX 280. Same architecture, fewer shader processors, half the price. On paper, the loser. In practice, it beat AMD's Radeon HD4 870 in test after test, a card AMD had built specifically to win that fight. The GTX 260 ran hot, and a weak PSU would feel it. But it ended up in more rigs than any flagship that year, because it won the only benchmark that matters, the one where real people decide what to buy. Price the second best card like it's the best, and buyers flood toward it. NVIDIA noticed. What they built next took that lesson somewhere much darker. GTX 480. Reviewers called it a space heater with a DVI port. NVIDIA's own engineers called it a disaster. It also happened to be the fastest single GPU card on the planet. Here's what the spec sheet doesn't say. For me, was designed as a compute card first. NVIDIA's data center ambitions shaped the architecture before gaming got a look in. The GTX 480 wasn't a gaming card that ran warm. It was a server chip that happened to play Crisis. That's why it pulled 180 watts. That's why it throttled under sustained load. Against AMD's HD5 870, it won on DX11 performance and lost on everything else. Heat, noise, price, power draw. Most buyers chose AMD. Brute force has a ceiling, and NVIDIA went back to the drawing board. GTX 680. After Fermi, NVIDIA needed to win back the crowd that had quietly moved to AMD. The GTX 680 didn't just beat the competition, it made them look inefficient by design. The biggest innovation wasn't raw performance, it was GPU Boost, the first dynamic clock system that pushed the GPU above its rated frequency automatically, whenever thermals allowed. The card ran faster than its spec sheet promised in real time. Every modern GPU does this now. NVIDIA built it here in 2012, while the competition was still counting cores. 2 gigabytes of RAM on a 256-bit bus was a quiet weakness. Games in 2012 didn't care. Games 2 years later did. Against AMD's HD 7970, faster out of the box, aged worse. The 7970 outlasted it. The template was set, efficiency first, but the next challenge wasn't coming from AMD. It was coming from a segment NVIDIA had almost completely ignored. GTX 750T. No external power connector. 60 watts total, drawn from the PCIe slot alone. Drop it into almost any pre-built ever made, and it just works. That sounds like a compromise. It wasn't. At that power envelope, the 750 Ti outperformed cards from 2 years prior that drew 3 times the power. Maxwell wasn't a budget chip. It was proof that efficiency could do things brute force couldn't. 2 gigabytes of RAM was tight, and 1080p Ultra was a stretch. But for the enormous share of the market stuck on integrated graphics, in cases that couldn't handle anything more demanding, the 750 Ti was the answer to a question they'd been sitting with for years. For a lot of people, it was the first card they ever bought. That's not a small thing. GTX 970. There is a number that still makes people angry, 3.5, not 4. 3.5 gigabytes on a card sold as having 4. 2 months after launch, it emerged the GTX 970's memory was partitioned, 3.5 gigabytes fast, 512 megabytes significantly slower. Cross that line, underload and performance dropped hard. NVIDIA faced a class action. They settled. For most 1080p gaming through 2015, that threshold was never reached. For others, it was, and they felt it. The controversy was real. So was the value. Near GTX 980 performance at $329. Quiet, with strong NVENC for streamers. AMD's R9390 offered 8 gigabytes of VRAM at a comparable price. In 2015, the gap barely mattered. By 2016, it did. and the 970 aged faster than its raw numbers suggested it should. GTX 980 Ti. The Titan X launched in March 2015 at $999. 3 months later, NVIDIA released a card within 5% of it for $650. The 980 Ti had 2,816 shader processors to the GTX 980's 2,048. Not a 980, but slightly better. A different chip, full G M200 die, lightly trimmed, massively discounted. If you bought the GTX 980 before the 980 Ti arrived, that spring was rough. It ran hotter than the 980 and launched 12 months before Pascal. Awkward timing in hindsight. But 6 gigabytes of VRAM kept it competitive well into 2017. Against the Titan X, 5% slower, $350 cheaper. For any honest buyer, the 980 Ti won that comparison without much effort. Pascal was coming. When it arrived, it didn't iterate on Maxwell. It rewrote everything. GTX 1080 Ti. The GTX 1080 Ti launches. Reviewers run benchmarks. Several check their rigs for errors. It was faster than the Titan X Pascal, a $1,200 card, by a measurable margin for $699. Part of why it lasted, NVIDIA overcorrected from the GTX 970 scandal and shipped 11 gigabytes of GDDR5X on a 352-bit bus, more than any game would need for years. The over-engineering landed squarely in the buyer's favor. Still competitive in 2020, 3 years on. At $699, it reset what a premium GPU cost, and it launched without ray tracing or DLSS, features that would define every card after it. The 1080 Ti was the perfect product for 2017. It had no idea what was coming. The GTX era was almost over. One more card. GTX 1660 Super. RTX launched in 2018. Ray tracing, DLSS, new badge, higher prices, and an argument about whether any of it was worth paying for that ran for 2 years straight. The GTX 1660 Super was for people who didn't want the argument. Turing Silicon, no RT cores, no DLSS, $229 at launch, against the RTX 2060's $349. The performance gap in the titles most people actually played at 1080p was real but modest. The price gap was not modest. One thing worth knowing. The 1660 Super shipped with GDDR6 instead of the base 1660's GDDR5. Same die, different memory, 15% more performance. The bottleneck was bandwidth all along, and a single component swap proved it. No DLSS meant missing out when version 2.0 arrived in 2020 and genuinely started improving image quality, not just frame rates. Built for 2019. 2021 asked for something different. But for the buyer at $229, playing Apex or CSGO at 1080p, it was the obvious call. It still holds up.